Hello, welcome. The people joining, welcome to the webinar. Give about another minute just to get people in the room. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Okay, well, I'm going to get started. Hello and welcome. My name is Dominique Alex, and I am the Chief Executive Officer here at Mary's Place. Thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn with a live panel event on strategies for preventing family homelessness. I'll introduce our panel in just a moment, but first, if you have any questions you'd like to ask either now or throughout the time, would love for you to put those in your Q&A tab, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the webinar. We do these luncheons every few months, and you can find recordings of past lunch and learns on our website on different subjects relating to family homelessness, and that's at www.marysplaceseattle.org, and we'll also put that link in the chat. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Mary's Place stands on the lands and waters of the Coast Salish, the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Puyallup. The Coast Salish have resided here since time immemorial and are the original stewards of these lands and waters. Today, many Indigenous people continue to live and thrive in this place. Mary's Place is committed to ending family homelessness in our community. We cannot rightfully fulfill this commitment without acknowledging that settler colonialism is a root cause of family homelessness for Indigenous people. The goal of settler colonialism is to take Indigenous land through the eradication and erasure of Indigenous people. Because settler colonialism is not an isolated moment in the past, but an ongoing and persistent structure of oppression, we must act. This land acknowledgement is one of the actions that Mary's Place is taking to affirm that Indigenous people have not been erased. Indigenous people are here, alive, and strong. Mary's Place is also taking action to connect and build relationships with Indigenous people in our community, support Indigenous staff, and build opportunities for Indigenous families that are served by our organization. Mary's Place mission is to ensure that no child sleeps outside by centering equity and opportunity for women and families in our community. We do this through an innovative three-pronged approach that includes emergency shelter, and we provide 650 beds of shelter in King County in 3 shelters. We also have our mobile outreach team that takes supplies and housing resources to unsheltered families in their cars and their tents and move them into housing, and preventing homelessness by keeping families in their hard-won homes with rental and stability support. And we'll be taking some time today to talk about that third prong with our panelists. Costs continue to rise, including rents, and families continue to feel the economic impacts of the pandemic, causing many in our community to have to leave their homes. To better set the stage for today's discussion and the importance of slowing the flow of families into the homelessness system, Mary's Place is seeing an unprecedented amount of calls to our emergency intake line in King County. Of about the 50 calls we receive a day for families that are seeking emergency shelter, we are only able to serve 2 or 3 of those families each day. Too many families with children, often very young children, are sleeping outside. We must prioritize our children and keep families in their hard-won homes. And as our panelists will share today, we are and can do this. We need to scale this work to prevent more families from coming into this homelessness system and reduce the trauma on children and stop those generational cycles. So let me introduce you all to our panel and let's get started. First, I'd like to introduce Chad Bojorquez, who is the Chief Program Officer at Destination Home in Santa Clara County, California. And next is David Phillips, who is a research professor of economics at the Wilson Sheehan Lab of Economic Opportunity, also known as LEO, at the University of Notre Dame. And Miriam Clithero, who is our extraordinary Mary's Place Prevention and Stability Director here at Mary's Place. Thank you all for being here to share. Chad, let's start with you. Thank you for joining us today. The destination home model is incredibly effective for those who are not familiar with destination home, that the work that they're doing down in the Silicon Valley to end family homelessness. We're going to share a link in the chat to their website, so you can explore and learn more about their work. But first, let's talk about Destinations Home's work and how that's been a model for Mary's Place and the nation. Chad, can you share a little bit about your prevention work at Destination Home?
Yes, definitely. Good afternoon. Thanks, Dominique. Thanks for having me and Destination Home involved. I think just picking up on something that you talked about, which is, around families with children sleeping outside and just the rise of homelessness and people not being able to afford their rent across the country. A study came out earlier this year that indicated that over half of America's renters can't afford their rent. And that's like our nationwide context right now. In Silicon Valley, I know it's the same in Seattle, very high priced areas. We're seeing, our data shows that over the last 18 months, rents have risen by 12%. And we have over half of the people who are accessing our homelessness prevention system who are 100% rent burdened, which means on paper, we don't know how they're surviving, which of course is why they're coming for help. Back in 2017, we started the homelessness prevention system in collaboration with our county, which provides most of our safety net services, our largest city of San Jose, and a group of really foundational private funders, and just really set out to build a new system for how we prevent homelessness. There was no, in Santa Clara County at the time, in 2017, there was really no kind of concentrated intentional effort to prevent families from becoming homeless. At that time, we had really built up our supportive housing system and we're housing more people than ever, while also seeing homelessness rise, because there was no effort to keep people in their homes. So we set out to build a system and a network of organizations across our county to do whatever it takes to prevent homelessness one family at a time. And that's what we've done. We started out with approximately $1.5 million, majority privately funded, to serve about 220 families in that first year. Today, our network is much larger, and I'll jump into that in a moment and actually show kind of the dramatic shift in public to private funding. But just wanted to highlight, some of our key findings. We find that by being flexible and really digging in with each family to do whatever it takes, that we've been incredibly successful. Just to give a sense, so we have a homelessness prevention system that the primary intervention is financial assistance, right? Usually somebody has a financial need and a crisis right in front of them. Oftentimes rent, but we have the flexibility in our system to address other needs. Sometimes people have paid rent with every, last penny that they have, and now they don't have their money to pay for their car to get to work, etc. And so being flexible with the amount of money and the types of things that we can pay for has been a hallmark of our system and our success. Also, having a network of partners that are large and small across the county to make sure that we can really access and serve the most vulnerable people in our community has been a huge part of our success. So we have 19 organizations across Santa Clara County that are all networked together and are bridged by one organization, Sacred Heart Community Service, that is like our network coordinator. And they help umbrella the entire network and make sure that we have best practices, data collection, quality improvement, and so that the journey of each individual family is kind of uniform, and that the family doesn't have to worry about like, oh, this organization has more resources than that one, or that organization doesn't serve my zip code. We eliminated all of those considerations for the family and just said, wherever you step into the system, we're going to help you in the same way. And then finally, making sure that we have very institutional support from our public sector partners from the beginning, along with our private funding, has been really beneficial to make sure that once the families get enrolled, that they have access to all the safety net benefits that are critical for kind of stabilizing a household. So we've been doing this for a little over 7 years, and across that entire time, the average financial assistance that we've provided to each family remains around $7,000. So an extremely affordable intervention. And even after families leave their support, so they exit the system, so to speak, the kind of the industry term, they're still 93% successful in staying housed, which is really incredible. It's been the most kind of outcomes-driven, successful program that I've ever been a part of. And if you could pull up the slides, please. I just want to show kind of how we have transitioned over time from a largely privately funded system. So this is back in 2017 where we started. We had, Packard Foundation, Sunlight Giving, Google, and a couple of other private funders who really pitched in and said, you know what, we're gonna really believe in setting up the system to prevent homelessness. And you can see we started humbly, and we had a little bit of public funding, mostly general funds from our county and city. Today, if you go to the next slide, please. The system has year over year expanded in its capacity and its funding to serve nearly 1,700 new families a year. So that's new families plus the existing families. At any given time, we have approximately 2,500 to 3,000 families being assisted at any given time by the network of 19 nonprofit partners. And you can see that it's totally flipped, right? We have primarily public sector funding. Public funding is always going to be more sustainable. And so the public sector is leveraging a smaller amount of private funding now. And what you see on listed in the bullet points is just the different variety of public funding sources. So we have a local tax measure for our largest city of San Jose. We have state funding, we have federal funding, we have small cities funding, general fund money, we have Medi-Cal and Cal-AIM, which is obviously we're in California, so everything has to have Cal associated with it. But these are safety net, state or federal level funding sources that are typically given to peripheral or adjacent systems that are being integrated into the homelessness prevention system. So we just wanted to show kind of like how this has worked over time, and opportunity that if you start small and humbly with some private sector investment, how quickly you can get to a pretty large sustainable system.
Wow, Chad, this is incredible. Thank you for sharing the journey, right? It's definitely a journey, but to see the outcomes, you talked about 93% of families are actually staying stable in their homes. That's incredible work. And that's where we want to keep families. We want to stop those generational cycles of homelessness and just reducing that trauma on that next generation of children. So thank you so much for sharing the great work that you all are doing in Santa Clara County. And next up, before I move on, I actually want to remind people that there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions for any of the panelists, please continue to put those there and we'll answer those towards the end of the webinar. And so next up is Miriam. It's great to see you. Thank you for joining us today. As an organization, Mary's Place has recognized the importance of keeping families in their hard-won homes for several years. As our Director of Prevention and Stability, can you please share with us what you are seeing, why we think prevention is such a promising strategy? And I know we have David and the Lab for Economic Opportunity with us here to talk about the current research project, but maybe an overview of the work and what we're hoping to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dominique. It's great to be here. Eviction prevention and rental assistance is, as Chad stated, is just a vital component of the homeless response system. By preventing families from falling into or returning to homelessness, we're really proactively preventing childhood and family trauma and re-traumatization. As my colleague Allison Moon has really rightly stated, there is no safe level of homelessness for children. So we've seen, particularly since the pandemic, that rental assistance is an extremely cost-effective strategy compared to more traditional responses like shelter even. Families can stay housed, keep their belongings, their keepsakes and vital documents. Kids don't become displaced and have to move schools mid-year, or disrupt social relationships. So, we've been on this journey for actually a while. We have been testing innovative, mainly private donor-funded, smaller rental assistance pilots since 2019 that have culminated in the launching of our research evaluation with the Lab for Economic Opportunities, LEO. So from here on out, when we say LEO, that's what we mean. We mean David and his amazing team. But yeah, this visual may help kind of follow along as I take you on a little historical journey. In 2019, we launched a shallow rental subsidy pilot and supported 7 households for 1 year of monthly rental assistance, where the family could receive up to $600 per month. And then at the end, they could, if they'd been able to save any of those dollars, they were able to then cash out and have a bit of savings left over. And then at the end of 2020, with the crisis of the pandemic looming over families, we really saw a need there and launched a 2-month emergency rental assistance pilot for more than 40 households who we'd identified were just, for whatever reason, we're not going to get the first round of federal assistance that we saw coming into communities. And then the following year, we conducted another pilot, which supported 5 former Mary's Place families who were in housing, who had complex medical issues, and they received 8 months of rental assistance. We also did a separate pilot where we piloted flexible financial assistance for 7 families who were impacted by substance use disorder. So then, as we moved on to September of 2021, through March of 2022, we really started to expand and grow, and we launched EPRAP, which is also known as the Eviction Prevention and Rental Assistance Program that was supported through King County. And this was really the second federal COVID relief funding package. So we, alongside our amazing partners at Boys and Girls Club, Community Passageways, and the Eastside Legal Assistance Program, we were able to assist 370 households with distributing $4.2 million in rental assistance, with the average assistance being about $11,500. That was amazing, and we learned so much from that work. And really that led us into 2022. This spring, we were planning to continue the work and realized we had an opportunity to apply for the new LEO cohort in the Seattle King County area. And we're super thrilled to be accepted to that cohort in June. But even before we had applied, we actually were doing some really great learning from Destination Home, and in particular the Sacred Heart, as Chad mentioned. They've been an amazing partner with us and mentor in many ways. We were super intrigued by the research and what they were seeing. And we were particularly interested in their program model. So their program model is, as Chad mentioned, it was really allowing households to return for help when they needed, and where, and I think we were really hoping to understand, what's the impact of this type of assistance, and what would that look like specifically for families. We realized that, with our new LEO partnership, we had an opportunity to deepen, the local and national understanding of what kind of eviction prevention works best for families. And what we've seen typically in King County, I don't know if a lot of folks are aware of, is kind of what we call our business as usual rental assistance, where there's a cap on assistance. So usually 1 to 2 months of rent or so can be covered. And then the household can only receive help once per year. So what we really saw from Santa Clara was that, by allowing households to return for assistance more than one time, that tenants were able to stabilize much more effectively. Thanks for taking down the slide. I've moved on. I do want to share just a smidge about the study, and then David will go into that more. We are about a third of our way into the research study, just a little over that. We've supported over 600 households since the study launched, with more than $3 million of eviction prevention, rental assistance, and also relocation assistance. And then I think finally to just sort of bring it close to home, families specifically have some really unique challenges compared to single adults and young adults. These families that we're serving right now are almost all single parent households, and they're almost all extremely, extremely low income. Most parents are working, but are in low paying positions and are below 30 and 40% of our area median income, which, for example, like a family of 3 is making between $20 to $25 an hour. But with median rents for a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment in the King County area, which range between like $2,400 to $2,800 per month, the new normal is seeing families pay more than 70 to 80% of their monthly income towards rent and utilities. I know Chad mentioned 100%. We are seeing that as well. And the single parent households that we're seeing are just often one sick kiddo away from getting behind in rent. And then too often a family will just start to get buried under late fees, notices, and then the deep, profound fear that they are going to lose their home. So I will pass it back to you, Dominique, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Really appreciate you sharing kind of what we're seeing in our area. It's really not sustainable to be paying 70 to 80% of your income towards your rent. And like you said, just one crisis away, right? So thank you for sharing. I also just was reflecting on just the partnership, I think, with Destination Home to really do all of the learning from you all in Santa Clara County, and to be able to build on that and share those learnings so that we can best support the families in our community, no matter where you're at. So I'm gonna keep moving us along. So thank you, Miriam. And I'm gonna welcome David. Thank you for being a part of our panel today. Mary's Place is partnered with the LEO team on a 3-year study to better understand how rental assistance is best distributed to prevent homelessness. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the LEO project and how this will build on the earlier research you did with Destination Home.
Yeah, I'm glad to. Thank you so much, Dominique. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here, both with both organizations, talking about this work and how well it fits together. So a little bit of where we came in. So yeah, as mentioned, my name is David. I'm from the Lab for Economic Opportunities, or LEO, at the University of Notre Dame. We work with social service providers, so nonprofit organizations, local governments around the country, on trying to measure impact, measure how much of a difference is the work that they're doing making in the lives of people that are working with their organizations. And so that involves working with the folks at Destination Home. I guess maybe about 5 years ago, we were probably at the place with the Destination Home folks where we are with Mary's Place now, where they were in a situation where, unfortunately, huge number of people needed their services, and they couldn't quite, didn't have enough financial assistance to be able to serve everybody. In that context, we were able to partner together, and that's unfortunate, yeah, unfortunate is not the right word, really challenging, right? That we were able to learn from that situation. So we worked with them to do a research study where we followed up on what happens to folks when they get financial assistance, what happens to folks when they unfortunately don't have access to financial assistance. And that resulted in a study showing that the model that Chad described before, demonstrating how much of a difference it makes, how different people's lives looks in terms of housing stability and whether they enter emergency shelter, et cetera, in response to getting that assistance. And so having that, strong evidence for look at how much of a difference this makes in people's lives, I think it has been an important thing to learn, but there are also things that we don't yet know. And so we've been partnering with Mary's Place to learn about the ways in which they're innovating and learning about not just, how much of a difference does homelessness prevention make, but how do we do it best? And so the question that we're working with them about, learning about, and I think we may have a slide or two here if that's helpful, is learning about the impact of financial assistance, and in particular kind of financial assistance that has a high cap and unlimited renewals, and seeing how that affects people's lives, both housing stability and other areas of well-being. Miriam sort of nodded to this, right? That the fact that often traditional homelessness prevention programs are sort of one-off assistance. It's like, hey, you can get a couple of months rent, and after you get that, you can't come back for a year. You know, that type of program is really, really common around the country, as many of you may be familiar with. And is a model that's been used in lots of different situations. And then the Santa Clara model and the model that Mary's Place is also now doing are an alternative to that. Is like, well, what if some people need a bit more assistance, right? What if 2 months of assistance is not enough? What if people need to be able to come back more often? And so the key thing that we're testing in this research study that we're doing along with folks at Mary's Place is what happens if we try out 2 different versions of homelessness prevention, one that looks like a more limited traditional model and one that looks like one that has more flexibility and ability for people to come back. How much more bang for the buck do you get from having greater access to resources? The second thing I'll point out about what we're doing with Mary's Place that's a little different than the previous work with Destination Home is also Mary's Place focus on working with people who've been previously who have previously experienced homelessness, right? So Mary's Place in this project is primarily working with people who have previously been, for instance, in family shelter. And so that's a group of people that's at really high risk of returning to homelessness. And so an additional question is, when we particularly think about these more intense services, if we target them to people who have the highest risk, is that a particularly effective way of responding? And so, yeah, this slide gives a sense of, right, so there's these 2 different pathways that we're comparing. So people are coming in and Mary's Place is operating these 2 different versions of homelessness prevention assistance side by side, one that's one-time assistance and one that has an option to return where people can come back for more assistance and have a higher cap. And so we're very excited to learn about how much of a difference that additional investment can make in people's lives. As Miriam mentioned, this study's going well so far, right? We're a little bit past 1 year of folks enrolling in this study. We expect to be enrolling for a little bit less than 2 more years, and expect that we'll have wrapped up and have final results to talk about from the study around fiscal year 2027. And so just really grateful for the Mary's Place team and our partnership on this, and also the way that this has flowed from our prior work with the team at Destination Home.
Thank you, David, for sharing a little bit about what we've been up to with you all. Partnership is key in this, and so all these learnings, I can't wait to get through the next 2 years. But I do want to thank you for the partnership and think about the results and what those will be providing us. It's just another piece to our puzzle, right? To help determine how we can best scale prevention and really successfully do that in Washington State and beyond, hopefully. So let me go back to Chad because I have a question. The destination home model is incredibly effective. Can you share a little bit about how that transition from private to, oh, you already talked a little bit about that. Sorry. I was thinking about the private public funding, but maybe you can talk a little bit more. You showed us a graph of that transition from private funding when you started smaller in your pilot, and then you moved to this really kind of transition to more public funding and a lot less private. Can you talk just a little bit more about that transition and how you all did that successfully?
Absolutely. I think for us, all of our work at Destination Home is, we're considered the backbone convener of our collective impact strategy to end and prevent homelessness in Santa Clara County. So everything that we do, we involve our system partners from the very beginning. And so, even though in the beginning, none of us had a whole lot of money, relatively speaking, like we were all sitting around the table together and saying, this is the problem that we need to solve, right? We need to build a system to prevent homelessness. Destination Home, you figure out how to do it. Like, how do you build a model that actually works, right? Like, let's prove the efficacy of the model. Let's use private funding because that's what we have available right now, but we'll put a little bit of public funds. And then once you figure it out, let's make this part of the coordinated entry system, right? Like, let's make this an integral intervention for how we, address homelessness in Santa Clara County. And so that's where we started. And those relationships, really didn't start because of homelessness prevention. About 4 or 5 years prior to that, we had really cut our teeth on creating our system to be around housing first and really kind of prioritizing the most vulnerable people in our community. We did like a top 1,000 most vulnerable homeless people in Santa Clara County, and really kind of geared our whole coordinated entry system and our supportive housing system around those priorities. And for our county, we didn't even have what's now called the Office of Supportive Housing before that started, just to kind of showcase like how we had really, I think, disparate accountability structures for who was responsible for ending homelessness. And so for us, a big success has been getting everybody around the community table. We have a 5-year strategic plan that's in its second iteration. We're about to start our third, called the Community Plan to End Homelessness. We put homelessness prevention in that second plan as a priority, which would then give us kind of the cover or the prioritization to go ahead and make that a huge priority and increase the capacity to serve what we're trying to address in our community. And most communities have some version of this, is like we have a record of what we call inflow, right? We have like the number of people who are coming to our system and saying, I'm homeless for the first time. So that's kind of like that's what we're trying to get to, right? Is to build the system big enough to where we could capture those families before they ever have to become homeless or stay homeless for very long. And so it was always part of the plan. And then for the first couple of years, it was just about figuring out how the system works, right? Like, okay, there's the network coordination piece, or you need to be flexible, or, it was mentioned by Miriam about how we do allow for re-enrollments, right? We allow families to come back into the system, really to be true to this, like, how do we do whatever it takes to prevent homelessness? And what we learned is like, you can't have arbitrary caps on the amount of money or how long you help families if you're really going to wrap around that family. We also learned things like we need to have, in the beginning, it was like a bunch of little fiefdoms, right? We had all of our nonprofits, and they were like, okay, this is my money for my area or my population. And so we put all of the financial assistance dollars into one big pot, which really opened up our system to be equitable and make sure that we're kind of drawing down on that pot based on need, not based on other factors like where you're geographically located or who has the largest presence and the ability to kind of, serve their membership, so to speak. So that was a big breakthrough. So we kind of did all that in the first couple of years and figure out, okay, this is a model that works. While all along having the University of Notre Dame, right, tracking this and validating the results that we were seeing. Also, and I think there was a question in the chat about this, all of the 19 partners do use HMIS. So that was another big kind of breakthrough for us, was to say, okay, if we're going to really associate our homelessness prevention system as part of our core homelessness response, we have to track data. And in our community, we robustly use HMIS to capture outcomes and data in an integritous way across all the organizations. And so our homelessness prevention system started using HMIS to track all of their outcomes, which also allows us to have like a whole view of their journey through our coordinated entry system. And then COVID hit. And so right around the time that we were already thinking about kind of transitioning the system that had been starting to prove successful, even though the research hadn't been published yet, COVID hit. And so that same network of organizations actually expanded to be 70 nonprofits at one point. But again, Sacred Heart was the coordinator. The funding mechanisms that we had been using through our homelessness prevention system remained the same, and we were able to kind of amplify our impact during COVID and get a bunch of money. In fact, we were able to get nearly $80 million out the door during the COVID period on the back, so to speak, of that same network. Once COVID kind of started to settle down, we went back to the conversations with the county and the city and our system partners and said, okay, we have a successful model here. We've gotten it up to scale, and there's going to be a lot of benefit for transitioning it over to the county, who kind of backbones our coordinated entry system at this point. And so as of July 1st of this year, the county has taken over direct operations of the homelessness prevention system and put it right alongside our rapid rehousing, our permanent supportive housing, and our shelter interventions. And so that's a huge success for us. But again, it started, 7-8 years ago. And this is the kind of the successful culmination of working with them all along the way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chad, sharing that journey and all of those lessons learned. One of the things I was hoping that you could share briefly is I heard you say HMIS, and there's varied folks on this call. And so if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about that acronym, and then we're going to move to some of the questions from our chat.
Absolutely. So the HMIS is the Homeless Management Information System. This is a kind of a database requirement from HUD, from the federal government, from the Housing and Urban Development, that most continuums of care across the country use. different continuums of care use different software providers to specifically, in their community. I actually believe that we both use the same one, but the point is that there's like a standardized database system that HUD asks everyone to use to provide, kind of universal data, right, around demographics and folks' journey around their housing status through our various systems of care. And so for us to incorporate the homelessness prevention system into the homeless management information system means that it's no longer thought of as a separate thing, right? I think the reason why homelessness prevention hasn't been prioritized by the federal government or by our systems of care is because it's thought of as a separate thing from how we prevent and how we end homelessness in our communities. But we all know, as we're treading water, like housing more people than ever, building, you all have a beautiful shelter and housing system in Seattle. As all of this work has been amplified and kind of honed in and been more and more successful, we're seeing homelessness either stay the same or rise in most communities because we haven't spent enough time thinking about how preventing homelessness is related to ending homelessness.
Thank you so much. Okay. So I am going to turn it over to Katrina to see if we have some questions in our chat from our folks that are on the webinar with us. So Katrina.
Hi there. Yes, some great questions coming in. There's also some questions that that I believe Chad and David have answered in the Q&A, which is great, and thank you so much. So you can go and look there later, but I'll bring some of those back here as well to share wider for the audience. But for the first question, so we kind of talked about prevention being so effective and cost effective. Why aren't we seeing more use of this strategy, and what needs to happen to increase the use of prevention in Washington and nationally?
Who wants to take that?
I mean, for us, we're just starting in this past year or so to have real talks with federal level partners, with the federal government, and some of our larger funding partners about what it would take to kind of take the successes that we've had in Santa Clara County and the successes of the kind of the research partnership with Leo. David mentioned about how their research around prevention is kind of like the one study builds on the next study and builds on the next study, which has also created kind of a network of different communities like Santa Clara County and Seattle and Chicago that we've kind of been learning from each other and building just really like a best practice case that prevention works. It's cheaper than almost every other intervention, and it's not adequately funded. There is no federal funding source that is dedicated to homelessness prevention. We have been able to use some recent in California state funding for homelessness prevention. And we've been able to get creative about some other funding sources that are kind of federal pass through to our county level systems. But HUD, for example, with their continuum of care funding has not made prevention a priority or created new funding sources for homelessness prevention. So our hope is to take what we've learned here and kind of replicate that in large and small cities across the country, kind of go down the same path, invest privately to get it off the ground, prove that it works, and hopefully politics will shift at a federal level and end up in a good place in a year or two to where they can actually come alongside us in that public-private partnership way that we've been able to show in Santa Clara County and really invest in prevention.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think, especially the part that like we're relatively early in the conversation about prevention and the evidence that we have behind it and how people have been innovating, that it's that kind of be a frustrating thing, like, man, why aren't we further ahead? But it can also be an exciting thing to think like, hey, a couple of decades ago, people were at a point with housing first and permanent supportive housing where there was early strong evidence. There was this realization of, oh, this is something that could be really big and make a big difference in people's lives. And you look sort of at how things took off. And in some ways, it feels like with prevention, we're just in that very early stage of this conversation where there's a lot of evidence that we needed that we didn't have. There was a lot of innovation that people needed to make around like what should these models actually look like. And it's been neat to see, like Chad mentioned, like people start to pick up that conversation both locally and through networks and at the national level. even in the past couple of years in ways that didn't seem like were happening before, at least to me.
I think the only thing I would add too is that I think yeah, there's just been a lack of awareness of this connection that Chad mentioned. And so I think like the more people who talk about eviction prevention in this way as like part of a really robust homeless response system will help as this data and sort of evidence continues to come out. I think kind of think about prevention in the way we thought about, diversion or creative conversations, right? Now, even the VA has, I don't know if it's the VA, but, veterans support services have adopted creative conversations. And that was something, that 8 years ago was maybe not on a lot of folks' radar. So I think it's really just making sure that connection. When I used to do diversion, for example, and outreach, I used to say I could not do this work without stability services and meaning money to support folks who fell into crisis right after they got housed. So I think there's that aspect as well, is continuing to connect the dots for folks.
Thank you. Katrina, can you go to the next question you might have from the panel? I mean, from the participants?
Yeah, sure thing. And this one actually might be for you, Dominique. Is there public funding for prevention in Washington?
Yeah, so there are a lot more resources of public prevention funding available than there have been in years past, and growing levels of funding for housing and affordable housing that will help, of course. But we know there just isn't enough at this current time with the level of need. And so we're gratified to see prevention as a priority at the state and federal levels, but it is limited. And as you've heard, again, the need is just growing. And so we know there will be more need for prevention to be have funding available as we think about these strategies of moving upstream and preventing families from coming into the system, reducing that trauma on children and those generational cycles of homelessness ending.
Great, thank you, Dominique. This question for you, David. Will there be additional research on prevention from Leo after this? What comes next?
Yes, yeah, so there's a lot of things in process. And I like the way that Chad mentioned it of sort of like a network of organizations that we've been working with. And part of it is connecting them, but part of it also is like learning different things in different communities so that together we all can kind of learn different pieces of it from each other, and we collectively learn, okay, what's, what is most effective in preventing homelessness. Some of the things that are going on that we're working on right now, we're working on these questions of like how best do you go about prevention, right? Which includes the study with Mary's Place. We have several studies that I think take that sort of further downstream to diversion programs, like in testing, so what happens when you intervene right at the point where the family's becoming homeless. We also have a series of studies right now that are working with COVID era programs like the one that Mary's Place participated in, the ERAP and ERAP programs, and people are familiar in King County, of understanding how those function and how the COVID era was different in a lot of ways than sort of normal times, obviously, but how did that play out in the impact that those sort of programs had. And so, yeah, there are lots of individual studies we're working on. We're also working with the folks at Destination Home and others nationally to think about, okay, like what's the research agenda? What are the open questions when you talk to practitioners and academics and policymakers? Like what are the questions that we need answers to in order to think about this nationally? And so we've been trying to also be very careful and coordinated about that, so that the particular studies that we end up starting the partnerships that we have add up to answering the questions that we all have and having the most effective prevention programs we can.
Thanks so much, David. Chad, you mentioned protecting those who are most vulnerable in the community. Could you share some the good strategies that are being used to determine the vulnerability of a family?
Yeah, it's a great question. The thing that I would just highlight first, and Dominique talked about this, or it might have been Miriam, I apologize, is extremely low income. So income level is like such a clear-cut way of determining who the most vulnerable people in our community are. And so in our system, we use a vulnerability assessment tool. It's a shortened, modified version of org codes prevention VI SPDAT that David and his team helped us shorten and modify during COVID because we were assessing thousands, literally thousands of people in mass, and spending 45 minutes with each of them and asking them vulnerable questions just wasn't realistic anymore. So we use that, thank you, to create a much shorter version that takes, less than 10 minutes and is not as invasive, to help determine who's the most vulnerable people in our community. 90% of those are extremely low income. 84% of them are people of color. 76% of them are women or women head of households. So these are our most vulnerable people in the community, right? 20% of them are seniors, older adults. 60% of them are families with children. So by using that assessment tool, we're getting to the most vulnerable people in the community. Another thing that we learned, especially during COVID, as we were saying, okay, you're in a kind of shortened crisis mode, and you're like, how do we make sure that we're reaching the most vulnerable people, right? Like the most vulnerable people don't necessarily speak English, are not necessarily going to eviction court because they're not even in a formal rental arrangement, right? They're not, looking at the news, seeing that we did a briefing with Cisco about our COVID response. So we needed community partners who were deeply entrenched into our communities and our neighborhoods and had the trust and the knowledge of a community. Even if those nonprofits were like what we affectionately call grassroots, meaning they didn't have all the infrastructures to cut checks quickly, for example, but they had the people, they had access to the people that we needed to help. So our job as part of the network was to build up the infrastructure of those nonprofits and support them and let them do their work best, and making sure that people needed the assistance the most were able to access it. So those are some of the strategies that we've used.
Thank you so much, Chad. For this next one, I think either for Miriam or David, the annual cost to prevent homelessness, how does that compare to the cost of shelter for that family?
You can take it fast, and then Miriam, you want to talk more locally? I mean, it's certainly providing your shelter to a family is certainly more expensive than serving one homelessness prevention family. It gets a little bit more complicated than that, right? Because some families who are provided with financial assistance might resolve it and have other things happen other than ending up in emergency shelter. And so it's a little bit hard to count up, right? Like how much benefit does that family get? How much money do we save on things like shelter and so on in response to providing financial assistance? That's a difficult question. We tried to answer that as best as we could in the destination home study. And so we added up a lot of that stuff, benefit to the family, reduce spending on shelters, reduce spending on other public services, et cetera. Try to add all of that up as best as we could. There we got about $2.50 of benefits to all of that for every dollar that was spent on the program. So we think you're getting more out of it than you put into it. That's a hard thing to add up, but I do think like this idea that you move upstream and you do something that is less expensive on the front end so that you get more benefits later by getting upstream and preventing. Like I think there's something to that argument, and I think like the numbers that we had from the destination home study resonate with that point of view, if that's sort of behind the question.
Miriam, do you want to, I can talk about the cost of shelter at Mary's Place and maybe give a little information about prevention. So for us at Mary's Place, a 90-day stay for family, and our average family size is about 3.5 people in a family, plus their pets. It costs about $23,000 to house them for 90 days. And our average length of stay right now is a little over 6 months. And so just think about, that for a family to stay at Mary's Place is more like 6 months, not the 90 days. And so Miriam, you can share maybe a little bit about what we're seeing with the average cost per family for the prevention of rental assistance.
Yeah, we are seeing a combined overall cost of around like for the year last year, it was around $6,600 between the two pathways, but the two pathways look very different. So for the one-time assistance, kind of business as usual pathway, our average assistance is around $3,500 per household. And then for the option to return pathway is what we call the pathway where folks can return when they are in need. That pathway, it's about $12,000 to $13,000 average assistance right now. So combining those, we get a lower number, but that's what we're seeing right now. And I think anyways, I could go on, and I say this all the time. I could talk about prevention all day long, but I'll stop there. It is ultimately just so incredibly cost effective to keep people where they are. We are even seeing some folks who need to relocate because for whatever reason we are not able to get them fully caught up, or maybe their rent has stacked up too high. We can't get enough funding together to cover like a $50,000 balance, for example. For them who have really high balances, we have been able to relocate some folks. Even that is so much more affordable than having them lose all their belongings, go into car camping, then possibly get into shelter or into, like an outreach program like ours, who do amazing mobile outreach work, and then rehoused, and then still have this debt hanging over it. It's much harder to even get housed after that happens. So there's like the actual dollar cost, but then there's the cost to there's the emotional and well-being cost of not being able to extend their length of stay in shelter or their length of time in their car, because it takes that much more time to find something that will actually work for them with a big debt under their belt. So yeah.
Thank you all so much for that really comprehensive answer. So since we are getting a little down on time, we'll have time for just a couple more questions. And so if we don't get to your question, we will be following up with an email later, and you can definitely reach out to us directly as well. But for this next one, would you just be able to just share how folks would be able to get a copy of the Leo study when it's complete?
I mean, for the Destination Home study, that study is complete. We have both the academic version of that and a 2-page version of that. So I'm sure we can work with the folks at various places. If there are people who are interested in seeing the summary of that study or the full study, we can get it to them. And then, our dissemination team and the wonderful folks at various places will be working together in a couple of years here when we're at the end of the study to be able to share that information out with the community.
Yeah. And we'd love to keep people appraised to what's happening along the way. So this is just the start. We are done with year 1, but we've got 2 more years to do our learnings. And so we'll be continuing to share information out with the community.
All right, thank you so much. Actually, looking at the time again, I think we will end on that note. And like I said, we can follow up directly for some of the other questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katrina. I want to thank our panelists for the great information you all shared today. And for everyone that joined us on this webinar, thank you. If you have additional questions or would like to talk to someone on our team, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to continue this conversation with you all. There are also several ways to support Mary's Place in our efforts to help ensure that no child sleeps outside in our community. Your financial support is appreciated, and members of our homes team or monthly donors ensure that we have resources we need to help families find their way back to housing. If you like to volunteer or do a drive in your community or make kits for the kids and families, check out our volunteer opportunities at marysplaceseattle.org, and we'll put a link in the chat. We'll be doing more lunch and learn events where we'll share about specific aspects of our work together with our partners to address and prevent family homelessness. And we hope to see you at those as well. At the end, once you come off the webinar, you'll see a survey pop up in your browser about this Lunch and Learn. We hope you take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about it and any discussion that you would like to share. And then thinking about other topics that may be useful for us, we welcome that feedback because we always want to share what is relevant or helpful for our community. So thank you for joining us today and have a wonderful Wednesday.